The chandelier above the grand hall scattered golden light across 600 faces, and every single one of them turned when Duke Corvin Ashgrove walked through the arched entrance with his bride on his arm. Lady Fenella Ashgrove smiled radiantly beside him. Her ivory gown, stitched with silver thread imported from Vienna, caught the light so perfectly that women nearby instinctively touched their own necklaces and looked away. Fenella possessed the kind of beauty that silenced entire rooms without effort. High cheekbones, flawless ivory skin, dark curls arranged beneath a diamond tiara that had belonged to the Ashgrove family for 3 generations. Corvin looked satisfied, more than satisfied. He looked victorious. Congratulations were offered immediately from every direction. Gentlemen shook his hand firmly, while their wives complimented Fenella's gown, her jewels, her hair, her posture, anything they could reach with flattery before the next person pushed forward. Near the center of the hall, Lord Pemberton raised his champagne glass and smiled warmly. "You have done remarkably well for yourself, Ashgrove. A beautiful bride from an excellent family. What more could a man desire?" Corvin straightened his shoulders and glanced sideways at Fenella, who tilted her chin upward with practiced elegance. "I have a wife now," Corvin replied loud enough for the surrounding crowd to hear clearly. "A wife, worthy of the Ashgrove name." Laughter and applause rippled through the guests nearest to him. Fenella pressed closer against his arm while accepting another round of admiration. Then Corvin's gaze drifted across the ballroom. At first he barely noticed, just movement between bodies, silk brushing past silk, faces blending together beneath the warm haze of candlelight and champagne. But something pulled his attention toward the far staircase, where the crowd had parted slightly, the way water separates around the bow of a ship. A woman descended the marble steps slowly. She wore deep midnight blue velvet, embroidered with tiny silver stars along the bodice and sleeves. Her dark hair was gathered loosely beneath a sapphire comb that caught the chandelier light with every step. She moved without hurry, without performance, without any awareness that the room had already begun to notice her. But it was not the woman who stopped Corvin's breathing entirely. It was the man whose arm she held. Marcus Theron Blackvane stood half a head taller than every man surrounding him. His dark coat was immaculate, his expression unreadable, and his reputation preceded him so heavily that guests stepped aside without being asked. Blackvane controlled more land, more wealth, more political influence than any 3 dukes combined. Invitations bearing his name were treated like royal summons. His absence from society for nearly 4 years had only deepened the fascination surrounding him. And resting gently against his arm, calm and composed, beneath the enormous chandelier, stood Iseline Durnford, the woman Corvin had rejected years earlier at his own birthday celebration, the woman whose family had called her an embarrassment for remaining unmarried, the woman society had pitied, whispered about, and quietly forgotten. Corvin's glass trembled slightly in his hand. Fenella noticed immediately and leaned closer. "Darling, what is the matter?" He did not answer. He could not answer, because Eileen had just looked directly at him across the ballroom. And for the first time in her life, she did not look away. But before we continue, if you enjoy powerful emotional stories filled with betrayal, heartbreak, jealousy, and stunning redemption, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring these unforgettable stories to life every single day. Now, let us return to where it all began. 3 years earlier, Iseline Durnford woke before sunrise inside the east wing of Durnford Hall, where the morning light never quite reached her windows. The bedroom had once belonged to a governess. When Iseline turned 25 without a marriage proposal, Lady Margot quietly reassigned her to the smaller quarters, explaining that Sabella needed the larger room for entertaining potential suitors. Iseline moved her belongings without argument. She had learned years ago that arguing inside Durnford Hall only made things louder, never better. The estate itself stood grandly among rolling hills in Ashworth County, surrounded by oak forests and stone-walled gardens that stretched toward the river. Marble staircases curved beneath painted ceilings inside the main hall. Portraits of distinguished Durnford ancestors lined every corridor, their gold frames polished weekly by servants who moved through the house like shadows. Lord Harland Durnford had inherited the estate from his father, and governed it with rigid devotion to reputation above everything else. Every meal, every gathering, every whispered conversation inside Durnford Hall existed in service of one obsession: how the family appeared to others. Isline no longer fit comfortably inside that obsession. By 28, she had become something the family did not quite know how to explain. Not married, not engaged, not even actively pursued. In a household where her younger sisters collected suitors, like pressed flowers inside leather journals, Eileen's silence became louder with every passing season, yet she was the one who kept the household running. Every morning, she reviewed kitchen inventories with the head cook, a tired woman named Hattie, who had worked at Durnford Hall for 31 years and trusted nobody except Isline. Together they planned meals for guests arriving throughout the week, adjusted budgets after Lord Harland reduced household spending without warning, and resolved arguments among younger kitchen staff who burned sauces or dropped serving platters before important dinners. Isline inspected guest rooms personally before every visit, straightening curtains, replacing wilted flowers, ensuring fireplaces were cleaned and bed linen smelled of lavender. She managed correspondence that Lady Margot found tedious, writing polite replies to distant relatives, charitable organizations, and parish committees that expected responses from respectable families. She oversaw the household accounts each Friday, balancing figures in a leather ledger that Lord Harland never examined but would have noticed immediately if anything went wrong. Nobody thanked her for any of it. One gray Tuesday afternoon, while arranging autumn flowers inside the front hall, Isline overheard Lady Whitmore, a visiting countess, speaking to Lady Margot inside the drawing room. "Your home is immaculately kept, Lady Durnford. You must have excellent staff." Lady Margot smiled graciously. "I take great care in managing the household personally." Isline placed another chrysanthemum into the vase, without changing her expression. Later that same afternoon, she found young Nellie, the scullery maid's daughter, sitting alone on the back kitchen steps, crying into her apron. The girl was barely 11 years old, thin-armed and frightened after accidentally shattering a porcelain serving dish that Lady Margot had specifically requested for Thursday's dinner. "She will dismiss my mother," Nellie whispered through hiccups. "We will have nowhere to go." Isline sat beside her on the cold stone step. "Listen to me carefully. I will tell Lady Margot. The dish was cracked already, and I removed it myself." "Do you understand?" The girl stared at her with enormous wet eyes. "But that is a lie, miss." Isline brushed a tear from Nellie's cheek and smiled gently. "Sometimes protecting someone matters more than being perfectly honest. Now go wash your face before cook sees you crying near her soup pots." Nellie almost laughed through her tears before scrambling inside. Isline remained sitting on the step for another moment, watching clouds move slowly across the October sky, breathing in the smell of wood smoke and damp earth. Moments like those were the only times she felt she still had purpose inside Durnford Hall. That evening at dinner, Lord Harland sat at the head of the long oak table, carving roasted pheasant while discussing parliamentary reform with a visiting magistrate. Sibella sat beside her mother, already wearing the pearl earrings gifted by her latest suitor, a baronet's son named Aldrich Fenn who owned profitable textile mills in Lancashire. Rosanna occupied herself with quiet gossip beside a cousin, while 19-year-old Cressida, the youngest, entertained the table effortlessly with a story about a horse that had escaped during a county fair. Isline sat at the far end of the table, closest to the kitchen corridor, a position that had gradually shifted over the years without anyone formally announcing it, She ate quietly while listening. When dessert arrived, the visiting magistrate turned toward her with polite curiosity. "And you, Miss Durnford, do you share your sister's interest in the season's social engagements?" Before Iseline could respond, Lord Harland answered for her. Iseline manages certain household responsibilities. She prefers practical matters. The word practical landed on the table like a stone dropped into still water. Sibella glanced at Rosanna. Cressida studied her dessert spoon carefully. Lady Margot adjusted her napkin without looking up. Iseline smiled politely at the magistrate and said nothing more. After the guests departed and servants cleared the dining room, Iseline carried a stack of unused linen napkins toward the storage cupboard near the west corridor. She passed Lord Harland's study and heard his voice through the partially opened door, speaking with Lady Margot. "Aldrich Fenn's family has expressed serious interest. Sibella's match could elevate our standing considerably." "And Iseline?" Lady Margot asked carefully. A long pause followed. "There is nothing to discuss regarding Iseline." Harland's voice carried neither cruelty nor sympathy. Only finality. "We must focus our efforts where results remain possible." Iseline stood motionless in the dim corridor, the linen napkins pressed against her chest while her heartbeat pulsed loudly inside her ears. Then she continued walking, because standing still inside, Durnford Hall had never changed anything before, and it would not change anything now. Late that night, while rain tapped steadily against the manor windows, preparations began downstairs for Sibella's engagement celebration. Rolls of imported fabric arrived from London. Servants carried flower arrangements through the corridors, while musicians exchanged letters confirming their attendance. From the top of the staircase, Iseline watched everything quietly, as excitement filled the house around her. Another sister was preparing to leave her behind, and somewhere deep inside her chest a question she had stopped asking years ago surfaced again without permission. What happens to the ones nobody chooses? Durnford Hall transformed over the following 2 weeks into something Iseline barely recognized. Carriages arrived every morning delivering crates of hothouse roses from London, cases of French champagne packed in straw, silver candelabras engraved with the Durnford crest, and bolts of cream-colored silk meant to drape across the ballroom ceiling like frozen clouds. The kitchens operated from before dawn until well past midnight. Hattie directed her staff with exhausted precision, while the air thickened constantly with the smell of roasting lamb, simmering berry compotes, fresh baked bread, vanilla custard, and spiced wine warming inside copper pots. Every corridor buzzed with nervous energy. Servants polished floors on their hands and knees. Gardeners trimmed hedgerows into geometric perfection despite freezing November rain. Footmen rehearsed serving formations inside the ballroom, while musicians tuned instruments beside the marble fireplace. And behind all of it, quietly holding every thread together, stood Iseline. She resolved a dispute between 2 florists competing over centerpiece placement. She personally recounted 300 pieces of silverware after a footman reported missing forks. She calmed a weeping seamstress whose stitching Lady Margot had criticized savagely before breakfast. She adjusted guest bedroom arrangements 4 separate times after Sibella changed her mind about which families deserved rooms nearest the main hall. By the morning of the celebration, Iseline had slept fewer than 9 hours across 3 nights. Shadows sat heavily beneath her eyes, and her fingers ached from tying ribbon after ribbon across chairbacks inside the ballroom. Sibella swept through the manor radiating satisfaction. Her engagement gown, crafted from pale rose satin with hand-stitched lace imported from Brussels, rustled softly with every confident step. Diamond drop earrings swung gently beside her jawline, while 2 maids followed closely, adjusting her gloves and smoothing invisible wrinkles from her skirt. As she passed Iseline in the corridor near the ballroom entrance, Sibella paused and tilted her head. "The candlesticks on the east tables are uneven. Honestly, Eileen, if guests notice crooked candles during my engagement dinner, I will never forgive you." She continued walking without waiting for a response. Eileen straightened the candlesticks herself. By evening, the ballroom overflowed with nearly 200 guests. Noble women glided between conversations wearing embroidered silk and glittering gemstones, while gentlemen gathered near the fireplaces discussing hunting seasons and political appointments. Platters of roasted duck, glazed with orange and thyme, smoked trout arranged on beds of watercress, creamed potatoes topped with chives, honey-roasted parsnips, and towers of sugared pastries layered with clotted cream covered the dining tables beneath the warm glow of 5 enormous chandeliers. Isline stood near the musicians, adjusting a flower arrangement that had tilted during the evening, when an elderly baroness approached her kindly. "You there, dear. Could you fetch me a glass of the white wine?" The one beside the far table, not the champagne. The baroness did not recognize her as Lord Harland's daughter. Isoline fetched the wine without correcting her. During dinner, the toasts began. Lord Harland stood proudly at the head of the table, lifting his crystal glass toward Sibella and Aldrich, who sat together beneath a floral arch constructed specifically for the evening. "To my daughter Sibella," Lord Harland declared with warmth Isoline had not heard directed at herself in years, "and to Aldrich Fenn, who brings honor and strength to the Durnford name. May their union bring prosperity to both families for generations." Glasses raised across the ballroom. Applause followed. Sibella beamed while Aldrich nodded graciously beside her, though Isoline noticed his smile tighten slightly whenever Lord Harland mentioned business prospects rather than affection. As the main course was served, Rosanna leaned across the table toward Isoline with an expression polished to resemble sympathy. "You must be so happy for Sibella," she said sweetly. "Truly, Isoline, watching your younger sisters marry must bring you such joy. Knowing they found happiness must be its own reward." Several guests nearby shifted uncomfortably. Cressida added without looking up from her plate, "Perhaps Isoline could plan all our weddings. She clearly has a talent for organizing celebrations, rather than attending them as a guest of honor." Soft laughter scattered across the nearest tables. Lady Margot pressed her lips together tightly, but said nothing to stop it. Then Sibella lifted her glass again, smiling brilliantly, toward the crowd. "To family," she announced, "to those who bring pride to the Durnford name through marriage, through alliance, and through knowing when to serve gracefully from the side." Her eyes rested on Isoline just long enough for every guest nearby to understand exactly who she meant. The laughter that followed was louder this time. Lord Harland did not laugh, but he did not correct his daughter either. His silence carried its own weight. Isoline placed her napkin on the table carefully, pushed her chair back without making a sound, and walked out of the ballroom before anyone could see her expression crumble. Cold November air struck her face the moment she stepped through the garden doors. Rain had stopped falling an hour earlier, but the stone paths remained dark and slick beneath her shoes. She walked past the rose garden, past the stone fountain where water still trickled quietly in the darkness, until she reached the wooden bench beneath the old willow near the lake. There, finally alone, she pressed both hands against her mouth and sobbed. Not the polite, quiet tears she had trained herself to produce whenever pain became unavoidable inside the manor. These were uglier, deeper. The kind of crying that bends your body forward and steals your breath between waves. She cried for the years of silence, for the dining table that pushed her further away with every season, for the father who spoke about her in the past tense while she still lived under his roof, for the mother who dressed her sisters in silk and handed Isoline lists of tasks instead. She cried until her chest ached and her throat burned, and the cold had soaked completely through her dress. Then footsteps approached slowly along the gravel path behind her. "Miss Durnford?" Isoline wiped her face quickly with trembling hands and turned Bet. Her lady's maid stood holding a wool shawl and a small cup of warm broth. "You will catch fever sitting out here soaked through," Betta said quietly, draping the shawl across Isoline's shoulders without asking permission. "I am fine." "No, miss. You are not fine. and you have not been fine for a long while now." The gentleness of those words nearly broke Eastline again. She tightened her jaw until the wave passed. Bet sat beside her on the wet bench, without caring about her own skirt. They sat together in silence, while the last of the ballroom music drifted faintly across the dark garden. Inside the manor, 200 guests celebrated a future that did not include Iseline Durnford. Outside, beneath a black November sky, the only person who noticed she had disappeared was a maid earning £12 a year. And somewhere beyond the hills surrounding the estate, a life Eileen could not yet imagine was already beginning to move toward her. Though she had no way of knowing it then, the worst of her suffering was not behind her. It was still coming. There had been a time when Iseline Durnford filled rooms with warmth simply by entering them. At 22, she played piano beside the tall windows of the music room every evening, while golden summer light poured across the quays. She laughed easily during dinner conversations, challenged visiting scholars with questions about philosophy and astronomy that made her father raise his eyebrows in quiet pride, and walked through the estate gardens each morning carrying books she had borrowed from every shelf inside the Durnford library. Guests remembered her, not for beauty alone, although she had been considered lovely, but for something harder to describe, a quality of attention. When Iseline spoke to someone, they felt as though the rest of the room had gently disappeared. That was before Edwin Calder arrived at Durnford Hall. Edwin came as assistant to a London architect Lord Harland had commissioned to redesign the estate's eastern conservatory. He was not aristocratic. His father had been a respected watchmaker in Cheltenham before debts consumed the family business, and Edwin had earned his position through talent rather than title. He spoke with a quiet confidence that never demanded attention yet somehow gathered it naturally. Their first real conversation happened by accident. Eastline had been reading alone inside the conservatory when Edwin entered carrying rolled drawings and measuring instruments, not expecting anyone to be sitting among the unfinished scaffolding. "Forgive me, miss. I did not realize this room was occupied." "It is hardly a room at the moment," Iseline replied, glancing at the half-demolished wall beside her. "More of a suggestion of a room." Edwin almost smiled. "That is rather generous. I would have called it organized destruction." They spoke for nearly an hour that afternoon. Edwin explained how conservatory glass could be angled to capture southern light during winter months, and Iseline surprised him by asking about thermal expansion in iron framing, something she had read about in a journal her father had discarded. By the second week, they spoke daily. By the third, Iseline brought tea to the conservatory each afternoon, setting a cup beside his drawings without interrupting his work. By the fourth week, they walked together along the river path after supper, discussing architecture, music, grief, and the strange pressure of living inside families that measured love through achievement. Edwin understood something about Iseline that nobody inside Durnford Hall had ever acknowledged. Her composure was not contentment, it was armor. "You carry silence like a shield," he told her one evening while they stood watching the river darken beneath a violet sky. "But I hear everything behind it." Iseline looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then, for the first time in years, she let someone see past the surface. She maintained so carefully inside her family's walls. They never touched, improperly. They never exchanged promises aloud. Yet something between them grew with the quiet certainty of roots spreading beneath winter soil, invisible but impossible to undo. Lord Harland noticed, before anyone else. One evening he entered the conservatory and found Edwin explaining watercolor sketches of the redesign while Iseline sat close beside him, her expression unguarded in a way Lord Harland had not seen directed at any man before. The atmosphere inside the study that night could have cracked stone. "You are a tradesman's son living on commission." "Inside my house," Lord Harland said with terrifying calm, "and you believed yourself entitled to my daughter's attention." Edwin stood straight despite the humiliation pressing down on him from every direction. "I have treated Miss Durnford with nothing but respect, sir. Respect does not concern me. Position concerns me. Reputation concerns me. The distance between your family name and mine concerns me greatly, and that distance is permanent," Eastline begged. She stood in the doorway of the study and pleaded with a man who had already stopped listening. "Father, he is decent and kind and intelligent. Those qualities should matter." Lord Harland looked at his eldest daughter with an expression closer to confusion than anger, as though she had spoken a language he genuinely did not understand. "Those qualities," he said slowly, "do not pay debts, protect estates, or carry family names into the next generation. This conversation is finished. What Eastline never discovered was what happened next." Lord Harland visited Edwin privately the following morning and presented a choice with surgical precision. The Calder family still carried substantial debts from the failed watchmaking business, debts that threatened Edwin's younger sister and aging mother with genuine hardship. Lord Harland offered to settle those debts entirely on one condition. Edwin would leave Durnford Hall immediately, sever all contact with Iseline permanently, and never explain why. Edwin spent the entire night pacing his small room above the carriage house. By dawn, he made the only decision he believed would protect the people depending on him, even though it meant destroying the one person who had finally made him feel whole. He left before sunrise without a letter, without a farewell, without a single word of explanation. Iseline waited for 3 days before accepting he was not returning. She asked servants. She checked the post obsessively. She even wrote a letter addressed to the architectural firm in London, which Lord Harland intercepted and burned inside his study fireplace the same afternoon. The silence that followed was worse than any rejection spoken aloud, because rejection at least confirms you mattered enough to be refused. Edwin's disappearance told Eastline something far more devastating, that she had not been worth even a goodbye. The piano inside the music room went untouched for months. The books beside her bed gathered dust. The woman who once challenged dinner guests with philosophical arguments began answering questions with polite smiles and single sentences. Bet noticed the change before anyone in the family. "She has gone somewhere inside herself," Bet whispered to Hattie one morning in the kitchen, "and I do not think she knows how to come back." Then 14 months after Edwin vanished, something unexpected happened. Duke Corvin Ashgrove began visiting Durnford Hall. Corvin was young, titled, enormously wealthy, and possessed the kind of easy charm that made older women blush and younger women compete. Lord Harland could barely contain his excitement. Lady Margot personally ordered 3 new gowns for Iseline from a dressmaker in London, the first time she had spent that kind of money on her eldest daughter in years. At first, Iseline resisted. The wound from Edwin's disappearance still ached beneath everything she did. But Corvin was persistent, attentive, and convincingly warm. He brought her rare books from his travels abroad. He asked about her thoughts on music and architecture with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. During one evening walk through the gardens, he told her something that cracked through her defenses completely. "I am not interested in decorative women, Iseline. I have met hundreds of them. I want someone whose mind I admire as much as her presence." For the first time since Edwin, Iseline allowed herself to hope. The courtship lasted 5 months. Society noticed. Newspapers printed speculative remarks about the Duke's unusual interest in Lord Durnford's eldest daughter, a woman already considered past her prime by aristocratic standards. Inside Durnford Hall, Iseline's status shifted dramatically. Suddenly she was seated beside important guests again. Suddenly her father mentioned her name with warmth during conversations. Then one spring evening, an invitation arrived to the Ashgrove estate for a grand dinner celebrating the Duke's 30th birthday. Iseline wore a gown of pale blue silk that Lady Margot had chosen specifically for the occasion. She entered the Ashgrove ballroom, carrying more hope inside her chest than she had allowed herself to feel in years. She found Corvin standing beside the grand staircase with his hand resting on the waist of Lady Fenella Whitmore. The announcement came before dessert. Duke Corvin Ashgrove was engaged to Lady Fenella Whitmore, daughter of the Earl of Stonebridge, whose family name, fortune, and flawless reputation made the match politically and socially perfect in every conceivable way. Corvin never looked at Iseline once during the announcement. Not once. She stood near the back of the ballroom holding a glass of champagne she could not bring herself to drink, while 200 guests applauded a future that had been built on the ruins of her last remaining hope. The carriage ride home was silent. Lord Harland stared out the window without speaking. Lady Margot adjusted her gloves repeatedly. Neither parent said a single word of comfort. That night, Iseline sat alone inside her small bedroom in the East Wing and understood something with absolute clarity. She had been auditioned twice, and twice she had been found insufficient. The woman who emerged after that spring was the woman the world saw now, quiet, composed, useful, and completely invisible. A woman who had stopped hoping, not because she was weak, but because hoping had only ever led to rooms full of people celebrating someone else. And the worst part, the detail that settled into her bones like winter cold that never fully leaves, was that she never learned the truth about Edwin. She still believed he had simply walked away. 7 months after Sabella's wedding, Durnford Hall erupted into celebration once again. Rosanna had secured an engagement to Lord Jasper Edworth, a man whose family owned sprawling estates across Wiltshire, and whose grandfather had served twice in the cabinet. Jasper was considered one of the most desirable unmarried men south of London. He was tall, sharp-featured, and carried himself with the kind of polished authority that made people assume he was important even before learning his name. Lord Harland practically glowed announcing the match during a private family dinner. 2 daughters married into excellent families within a single year, he declared. While raising his wine glass, the Durnford name has never stood stronger. His eyes did not travel toward Iseline at the end of the table. Preparations consumed the manor once again. This time, Lady Margot insisted everything surpassed Sabella's celebration in scale. Fresh orchids replaced roses. A string quartet was hired alongside the usual musicians. Venetian glass lanterns were imported to line the garden pathways, and a French pastry chef arrived 4 days early to construct an enormous centerpiece cake layered with marzipan and edible gold leaf. Iseline managed everything, just as before. She coordinated deliveries that arrived at conflicting times. She mediated between the French chef and Hattie, whose kitchen territory was being invaded by a man who refused to speak English during arguments. She personally hemmed tablecloths that arrived 2 inches too long after the London supplier sent the wrong measurements. She repaired a cracked window pane inside the guest bedroom assigned to Lady Edworth, Jasper's mother, after a gardener's ladder struck it during hedge trimming. She spent an entire afternoon rearranging floral centerpieces after Rosanna decided that orchids looked funereal and demanded lilies instead, which required sending a rider to the Hottos in the next county before sundown. At no point did anyone consider relieving her of these responsibilities or acknowledging that she performed them. Rosanna's engagement gown was made from ivory damask, embroidered with silver thread and tiny freshwater pearls stitched along the neckline. She spent the morning of the celebration admiring herself from 3 separate angles inside her dressing mirror, while 2 maids braided jasmine flowers into her hair. As Iseline passed Rosanna's door carrying pressed napkins, Rosanna called out without turning from the mirror, "Iseline, the welcome cards on the entrance table have a smudge on the 3rd line. We dried them before guests arrive." "There are 60 cards, Rosanna." "Then you had better start." Immediately, Iseline rewrote all 60 cards by hand in the next 2 hours, her wrist aching by the 40th. The celebration itself was magnificent. Nearly 250 guests filled the ballroom and spilled into the lantern-lit gardens where the November air carried the scent of roasting chestnuts and mulled wine. Platters of seared venison with blackberry reduction, poached salmon and dill cream, roasted root vegetables glistening with butter and rosemary, and trays of miniature lemon tarts, dusted with powdered sugar, covered every table surface. Isline moved through the evening like a ghost wearing her best dress. She refilled water glasses when servants fell behind. She redirected a confused elderly lord who had wandered into the servants' corridor, looking for the washroom. She smiled politely when spoken to and disappeared the moment attention shifted elsewhere. During the formal dinner, Jasper's mother, Lady Edworth, studied Isoline from across the table, with sharp, assessing eyes. "Psst, you are the eldest, are you not?" she asked directly, cutting through the noise around her. Unmarried still. The table nearest them fell, uncomfortably quiet. Before Isline could respond, Cressida tilted her head with a performance of innocent curiosity. Isline keeps herself wonderfully busy with household affairs. Lady Edworth, some women are simply born to organize rather than to marry. It is actually quite admirable when you think about it. The words landed with surgical cruelty dressed in a smile. Several guests looked down at their plates. Lord Harland cleared his throat but said nothing corrective. Later, during the toasting, Rosanna stood beside Jasper and addressed the room with rehearsed elegance. "I want to thank everyone who made this evening possible." She paused, then glanced toward Isoline with an expression balanced perfectly between affection and condescension. "Especially my eldest sister, who worked tirelessly behind every detail you see tonight. Isoline may never walk down an aisle herself, but she certainly knows how to prepare one beautifully for others." The applause that followed felt like being buried alive beneath politeness. Isoline did not leave the ballroom this time. She had learned after Sabella's celebration that leaving only created gossip. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face arranged into an expression so composed that only Bet, watching from beside the service corridor, recognized it as the particular stillness of someone trying not to shatter in public. After midnight, when the last carriages departed and servants began clearing the ballroom, Isoline climbed the staircase toward her room in the east wing. She passed the main corridor where Lord Harland and Lady Margot were speaking quietly outside their bedroom. She did not intend to stop, but her father's voice carried clearly through the stillness. "Perhaps it is time we consider Aunt Phoebe's estate in Cumbria more seriously. Isoline could live there quietly. The property needs management, and frankly her presence during these occasions has become increasingly difficult to explain." Lady Margot hesitated before answering. "People do ask questions, Harland. Every gathering, someone mentions her age. It reflects poorly on the family. Then we resolve it quietly. After Cressida's prospects are secured, we will make the arrangement." Isoline stood frozen at the top of the staircase, one hand resting on the banister, while the other pressed flat against the wall for balance. They were not simply ignoring her anymore. They were planning to remove her entirely. She walked to her bedroom, closed the door without sound, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at the dark window. No tears came this time. Something worse than sadness had settled inside her chest. A calm, hollow certainty that she had become a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. Bet knocked softly, 20 minutes later carrying a cup of chamomile tea. Isoline accepted it without speaking. Bet sat in the chair beside the small writing desk and said nothing either, because sometimes the kindest thing a person can offer is not words, but simply the proof that someone noticed you were hurting. Outside, frost spread silently across the estate grounds, while Durnford Hall settled into satisfied quiet. 2 daughters married brilliantly, a third preparing to follow, and the eldest, the one who built every celebration with her own exhausted hands, was being measured for exile to a cold property in the north where nobody would have to explain her existence anymore. 90 miles north of London, where the coastline fractured into black cliffs above the winter sea, Blackvane Manor stood like a scar cut into the landscape. The estate had belonged to the Blackvane family for over 200 years, built from dark stone, quarried from the cliffs themselves. The manor rose 4 stories above terraced gardens that descended sharply toward the shoreline. Enormous windows lined the eastern wall, offering views of nothing but gray ocean stretching toward the horizon. Inside, dark oak corridors connected vast rooms filled with ancestral portraits, marble fireplaces tall enough for a man to stand inside, and libraries containing over 14,000 volumes collected across 6 generations. Marquis Theron Blackvane had inherited all of it at 23, following his father's sudden death from a lung illness that consumed him in less than a month. At 39, Theron was considered the most powerful unmarried nobleman in England. Blackvane's shipping interests controlled trade routes between Liverpool, Cape Town, and Calcutta. Blackvane owned farmland stretched across 4 counties. Blackvane Investments funded railway construction, textile manufacturing, and 2 of London's largest private banks. Politicians treated his opinions as advance warnings. Businessmen treated his silence as a threat. Yet the man himself remained almost entirely absent from the society that obsessed over his name. Inside Blackvane Manor, routines followed strict patterns. Theron woke before sunrise, rode alone across the coastal paths regardless of weather, then spent the remainder of every day inside his private study, reviewing correspondence, financial reports, and legal documents. He ate most meals alone, at a desk rather than a dining table. Servants moved through the corridors with practiced quiet, having learned years ago that unnecessary conversation was not appreciated. He had not attended a ball banquet or social gathering of any kind in nearly 4 years. The reason for his withdrawal carried a name that London society still whispered during dinner parties when conversation turned towards scandal: Lady Oriana Sable. Oriana had entered Theron's life during a diplomatic reception at the Austrian embassy 6 years earlier. She possessed the kind of beauty that reorganized entire rooms around itself. Dark auburn hair framing sharp green eyes, a voice that carried warmth and intelligence simultaneously, and a gift for making every person she spoke to feel as though they were the only one who mattered. Theron, who had spent most of his adult life surrounded by women who pursued his wealth with barely concealed ambition, found himself disarmed by someone who appeared entirely uninterested in it. Oriana asked about his childhood rather than his fortune. She debated literature with him rather than flattering his taste. She arrived at dinners carrying her own books rather than jewelry catalogs. And when he spoke about the loneliness that sometimes followed him through the enormous empty halls of Blackvane Manor, she listened, without offering solutions, which somehow felt more honest than every rehearsed sympathy he had received before. Within a year, Theron had fallen completely. He introduced her to his grandmother, Dowager Marchioness Wynora Blackvane, a woman whose approval carried more weight inside the family than any legal document. He commissioned a sapphire necklace from a jeweler in Amsterdam and began drafting plans to renovate the east wing of the manor into private apartments designed specifically for the life he imagined sharing with Oriana. London newspapers speculated endlessly. Society watched with fascination as the reclusive Marquis appeared to have finally found someone capable of drawing him out from behind his fortress walls. Then a letter arrived at Blackvane Manor on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered not by post, but by a solicitor representing Lord Desmond Cray. The letter contained evidence, detailed and impossible to misinterpret, that Oriana had maintained a concealed relationship with Lord Cray throughout her entire courtship with Theron, private meetings at Cray's London townhouse, coordinated travel schedules that placed them together during weeks Oriana claimed to be visiting family in Dorset, financial records showing expensive gifts Cray had purchased for her during the same months Theron believed she was falling in love with him. The solicitor explained carefully that Lord Cray, having recently ended the affair himself, wished to inform the Marquess as a matter of gentlemanly obligation before the engagement was publicly announced. Theron read the letter twice inside his study, while rain streaked down the enormous windows behind him. He did not shout. He did not break anything. He sat perfectly still for over an hour while the fire beside him slowly died. Then he sent for Oriana. She arrived at the manor 3 days later, wearing a traveling dress the color of autumn leaves, her expression already arranged into something between concern and innocence. Theron placed the evidence on his desk between them without speaking. Oriana's composure held for approximately 9 seconds. Then her face shifted through several expressions in rapid succession. Shock, calculation, and finally something resembling defiance. Desmond meant nothing, she said quickly. He was a diversion during the weeks you disappeared into your work, and left me alone in London with nothing but invitations addressed to your name instead of mine. Theron stared at her for a long time before answering. You are standing inside a house I was rebuilding for you, wearing a necklace I designed for you, defending a betrayal you committed against me by blaming me for working to provide the life you claimed to want. Oriana's jaw tightened. You are a man who lives inside ledgers in silence. Theron, I needed warmth. The words landed like a blade drawn slowly across something already wounded. After she left, Theron sat alone inside the study until dawn. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He removed the sapphire necklace from his desk drawer, walked to the eastern cliff path in the gray morning light, and threw it into the sea. The withdrawal that followed was absolute. Invitations accumulated unopened across his desk for months, then years. Society initially interpreted his absence as grief, then as eccentricity, and finally as a permanent condition they simply worked around. Ambitious families still sent letters and introductions, but Theron's secretary returned everyone with identical polite refusals. Women who encountered him during the rare occasions he conducted business in London found him courteous but completely unreachable. He answered questions without offering conversation. He acknowledged compliments without returning them. He maintained distance so consistently that people eventually stopped attempting to close it. His grandmother Wynora was the only person who still challenged him directly. One January evening, she entered his study, carrying a plate of cold roast beef and pickled onions. She had assembled herself from the kitchen, refusing to wait for servants. You are becoming your grandfather, she said flatly, settling into the chair across from his desk without invitation. And your grandfather died alone inside this house arguing with portraits. I am not arguing with portraits. Not yet. Give it time. Theron looked at her with the faint shadow of warmth he reserved exclusively for this woman who had raised him after his mother died, during his childhood. Wynora studied her grandson with eyes that had watched 3 generations of black-veined men build walls around themselves and mistake isolation for strength. She was one woman, Theron, a dishonest one. And you have allowed her dishonesty to imprison you more effectively than she ever could have managed. While standing in this room, Theron turned back toward the rain-covered windows. Trust is not something I intend to experiment with again. Then you intend to let Blackvein end with you. No heir, no family. Just this house, and the sea, and your pride keeping each other company, until there is nothing left. The silence that followed lasted long enough for the fire to crack twice inside the grate. 3 weeks later, an invitation arrived bearing the Durnford family seal. Lord Harlan Durnford requested the Marquess's presence at the engagement celebration of his youngest daughter, Cressida Durnford, to Captain Everett Hale of the Royal Dragoons. Under any normal circumstance, Theron would have discarded it immediately. But Lord Harlan's growing influence among northern industrial investors intersected directly with Blackvein shipping contracts currently under renegotiation. Refusing outright carried minor but unnecessary political risk. Theron held the invitation in his hand for several minutes, standing beside the tall windows while winter waves shattered against the cliffs below. You are considering attending his steward? Callum asked from the doorway, with carefully controlled surprise. For one evening, Theron answered, without expression. Nothing more. Callum nodded and withdrew, though his eyebrows remained elevated well after closing the door. That night, inside the vast silence of Blackvane Manor, Theron sat alone beside a dying fire and stared at the Durnford invitation resting on his desk. He expected another evening surrounded by performances. Smiling faces attached to calculating minds, flattery wrapped around ambition, beauty deployed as currency. E had no way of knowing that inside a cold bedroom in the east wing of a distant estate, a woman who had stopped believing in hope was staring at her own dark window, preparing to survive yet another celebration built on top of her invisibility. Two people, separated by 90 miles of frozen countryside, carrying wounds inflicted by people who claimed to love them, both believing the worst was already behind them, both completely wrong. The night of Cressida's engagement celebration arrived beneath skies heavy with January frost. Durnford Hall had been transformed once more into a monument of aristocratic excess. Ice sculptures carved into the shapes of swans flanked the ballroom entrance. Thousands of white candles burned inside crystal holders, arranged along every windowsill, staircase, and tabletop, casting the entire manor in warm amber light that softened every face and gilded every surface. Enormous silver platters carried roasted beef carved paper, thin and fanned across beds of horseradish cream, whole-baked trout dressed with capers and lemon, buttered asparagus tied with chive ribbons, towers of oysters resting on crushed ice, and delicate pastry cups filled with brandied mushrooms and melted Gruyere. The scent alone could stop a person in the doorway. Captain Everett Hale stood beside Cressida near the marble fireplace, his military dress uniform pressed to perfection, his posture rigid with the particular confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Cressida laughed brightly beside him, though Iseline noticed how her youngest sister's hand occasionally tightened around Everett's arm whenever his attention wandered toward other conversations. Iseline had spent the previous 4 days sleeping fewer than 12 hours total. She had supervised the complete rearrangement of the ballroom after Cressida changed the seating plan twice in one afternoon. She had personally repolished silver trays that a junior footman had streaked with fingerprints. She had calmed Hattie after Lady Margot criticized the soup course during a tasting and reduced the head cook to furious tears inside the pantry. Now she stood near the east wall, partially hidden behind a column draped with white silk, wearing a dark gray gown that Lady Margot had not bothered selecting for her. Iseline had chosen it herself from the back of her wardrobe. It was clean, it fit properly, and it would make her invisible, which was all she wanted. Then Marquess Theron Blackvane walked through the entrance, and the entire celebration shifted on its axis. Conversations did not simply pause. They collapsed. Women mid-sentence stopped speaking entirely, their eyes following the tall figure in the dark coat as though pulled by something magnetic. Mothers gripped daughters' arms hard enough to leave marks through silk gloves. Gentlemen straightened, instinctively adjusting cravats and squaring shoulders without realizing they were doing it. Lord Harlan moved forward so quickly to greet him that he nearly tripped over a footman carrying champagne. Marquess Blackvane. What an extraordinary honor. We are deeply grateful for your presence tonight. Theron acknowledged the greeting with a single nod. His expression remained neutral, which somehow carried more authority than any smile could have managed. For the next hour, Iseline watched from her position near the column as every ambitious woman in the ballroom attempted to orbit Theron Blackvane. Lady Felicity Drummond laughed too loudly at something he had not intended as humorous. Miss Catherine Bromley complimented his estates 3 separate times within a single conversation. An older countess asked whether Blackvane Manor ever hosted guests, her implication transparent enough to embarrass her own daughter standing beside her. Theron answered each approach with courtesy, so precise and so empty that every woman walked away, feeling as though she had been speaking to a closed door, wearing a polite expression. Then something happened near the service corridor. An elderly gentleman, Viscount Aldrin, a man well past 80, with unsteady legs and failing eyesight, stumbled badly while attempting to navigate the short step between the ballroom floor and the raised dining platform. His walking cane slipped on the polished marble, and his body pitched forward with the terrifying helplessness of a man too old to catch himself. Two nearby guests stepped backward, instinctively protecting their own gowns from the wine spilling from Aldrin's glass. A woman nearby gasped, but did not move. A footman across the room began walking toward the scene, but was too far away to arrive in time. Iseline reached him first. She caught the old man's arm firmly before his knees struck the floor, absorbing his weight against her shoulder while steadying his cane with her other hand. Wine splashed across the sleeve of her dark gray gown, soaking through to her skin, but she did not flinch or glance down at the stain. "Steady now," she said quietly, guiding him upright with practiced gentleness. "You are perfectly safe. Take a moment." Viscount Aldrin gripped her arm with trembling fingers, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Forgive me, child. These legs have forgotten their profession." Iseline smiled warmly. "They carried you to the finest celebration in the county tonight. I would say they have performed admirably." The old man laughed, despite his embarrassment. Iseline guided him carefully to a chair, fetched a fresh glass of wine herself, and placed it in his hands before anyone else in the room had finished processing what happened. Nobody applauded, nobody thanked her. Within 30 seconds, conversations had resumed around them as though nothing had occurred, but from across the ballroom, Theron Blackfane had not moved. He had not blinked. He had watched the entire scene unfold, with an expression that had shifted from neutral observation into something far more difficult to name. He watched Iseline return quietly to her position near the column without seeking acknowledgement from anyone. He watched her adjust her stained sleeve without complaint. He watched the way her own family continued their conversations without registering that she had just prevented an elderly nobleman from breaking bones on their ballroom floor. And the wall he had spent 4 years building inside his chest developed a fracture. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a single hairline crack running through stone he had believed was permanent. For the remainder of the evening, Theron observed Iseline the way a man watches a light he cannot explain appearing in a place he had decided was permanently dark. He noticed how servants relaxed visibly when she passed nearby. He noticed Hattie bringing her a small plate of food, personally, something the cook did for nobody else. He noticed Sabella openly rolling her eyes when Iseline adjusted a flower arrangement, and Rosanna exchanging a mocking whisper with Cressida behind their fans after Iseline spoke briefly with a guest. Most clearly, he noticed the silence surrounding her. Not the silence of someone overlooked by accident, but the deliberate silence created when an entire family agrees without ever speaking it aloud that one person among them does not count. Theron set down his untouched wineglass and began walking. Iseline did not notice the Marquess approaching until his shadow fell across the floor beside her. She had been adjusting a candle that had tilted dangerously near a silk drape, her attention entirely occupied by the practical concern of preventing the Durnford ballroom from catching fire during her youngest sister's celebration. When she turned and found Theron Blackfane standing less than 4 feet away, looking directly at her, the candle nearly slipped from her fingers entirely. "Miss Durnford," his voice was low, unhurried, and carried no inflection. She could easily interpret. It was not warm. It was not cold. It was simply present in the way that deep water is present beneath a calm surface. Iseline recovered as quickly as she could manage, though heat rushed immediately into her face. "Your Grace, forgive me. I did not see you. You were preventing a fire." She blinked, uncertain whether he was observing or mocking. His expression offered no guidance. "The candle was tilting," she explained carefully. "I noticed. I also noticed you were the only person in this room who did." The sentence carried something she could not immediately identify. Not flattery. Not charm. something closer to a factual observation delivered by someone who had been watching far more carefully than she realized. Around them, the ballroom's attention had already begun shifting. Heads turned with the particular intensity of people, pretending not to stare while staring with absolute commitment. Sabella's wineglass paused halfway to her lips. Rosanna straightened visibly in her chair. Lady Margot's fan stopped moving entirely. Theron appeared completely indifferent to the attention surrounding them. "You assisted the Viscount earlier," he continued calmly. "The gentleman who stumbled near the dining step." Iselin hesitated. Anyone would have done the same. No, they would not have. I watched specifically to see if they would. Nobody moved except you. And afterward, nobody acknowledged it, including the man himself once his embarrassment faded. Iselin studied Theron's face carefully, searching for the angle she expected every powerful man to carry somewhere behind their words. She had learned painfully that compliments from men of his position almost always arrived attached to invisible conditions. She found nothing except steady, direct attention. "That is a rather bleak observation, Your Grace." "It is an accurate one." Silence passed between them for several seconds while music played softly across the ballroom. Then Theron spoke again. "Would you care to walk?" "The gardens appear less congested than this room." The directness of the invitation caught her entirely off guard. Men did not approach Iselin Durnford at celebrations. Men approached her sisters. Men approached the women wearing jewels and confident smiles and youth arranged like armor. Men did not cross ballrooms to invite the eldest, unmarried, gray-gowned daughter to walk through frozen gardens. Yet here one stood, and not just any man, the most reclusive, powerful, and socially impenetrable nobleman in England. Iselin swallowed. "Carefully, the gardens are rather cold tonight, Your Grace." A faint movement crossed Theron's expression. Not quite a smile. Something closer to recognition, as though her honesty had confirmed a suspicion he had been testing. "Then we will walk briefly." They passed through the glass doors into the lantern-lit garden, while every pair of eyes inside the ballroom followed their departure. The air outside was sharp with frost and smelled of frozen earth and distant wood smoke. Their breath formed small clouds beneath the Venetian glass lanterns lining the gravel path. For nearly a minute, neither of them spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It felt deliberate, as though both of them were testing whether the other could tolerate quiet without filling it with performance. Iselin broke first, though her words surprised even herself. "You do not enjoy these evenings," she said. It was not a question. Theron glanced sideways at her. "That obvious? You have spent the entire night answering people without once initiating conversation. You hold your glass without drinking from it. And you positioned yourself near the corridor exit 3 separate times, as though measuring the distance to your carriage." The controlled blankness in Theron's face shifted slightly, revealing a brief flash of what looked almost like amusement, though it disappeared before she could confirm it. "You were observing me." Iselin felt her face warm despite the cold air. "I was standing near a column with nothing to do for 4 hours. Observation was inevitable. This time the corner of Theron's mouth moved unmistakably. They walked slowly along the frosted garden path, while Iselin spoke about the difficulty of standing inside celebrations that were built around other people's happiness. She did not reference his title once. She did not mention Blackfane Manor, his shipping empire, his political influence, or any detail that ambitious women typically deployed as conversational currency within the first 3 minutes. Instead, she described the specific exhaustion of being needed for labor, but excluded from joy. She described the sound of applause for someone else's future, echoing through a ballroom, where you were standing but not truly present. Theron listened without interrupting. His attention never drifted. And when they returned to the ballroom entrance 15 minutes later, he stopped and turned toward her. "Miss Durnford, This is the first honest conversation I have experienced inside someone else's home in longer than I care to calculate. Isline looked up at him, standing beneath the frosted lantern light, with wine still staining her sleeve and no jewelry anywhere on her body. Honesty is considerably easier when you have nothing left to protect your grace. The words hung between them in the cold January air. Theron studied her face for a long moment. Then he nodded once and walked back inside without another word. Inside his carriage, 30 minutes later, as horses carried him through dark frozen countryside toward Blackvane Manor, Theron sat completely still while a single thought repeated itself with quiet, unsettling persistence. She had nothing left to protect, and she still chose to be kind. He stared at the passing darkness through the carriage window for a very long time before closing his eyes. Within 3 weeks of Cressida's celebration, Marquess Theron Blackvane had visited Durnford Hall 4 times. Each visit arrived without excessive announcement. A brief letter the day before. A carriage appearing along the gravel drive by mid-morning. Tea served in the drawing room, followed by walks through the winter gardens, or conversations beside the library fireplace that lasted well past the hour politeness required. The first visit, Lord Harland hovered nearby, with barely concealed excitement, inserting himself into every exchange and steering conversation toward business opportunities. By the third visit, Lady Margot had transformed entirely. Expensive gowns arrived from London addressed specifically to Isaline for the first time in years. A sapphire pendant appeared on her dressing table with a note, in her mother's handwriting reading simply, "Wear this Thursday." By the fourth visit, Lord Harland had begun referring to Isaline during conversations with guests as my eldest daughter, whose company the Marquess has come to value greatly, as though her existence had suddenly become worthy of acknowledgement now that it reflected favorably upon his own. Isaline recognized the performance for exactly what it was. But she said nothing, because saying something inside Durnford Hall had never changed the script before. Meanwhile, her sisters were watching with the particular intensity of women whose own reflections had begun showing cracks. Sibella's marriage to Aldrich Fenn had deteriorated rapidly. The textile mills that once represented prosperity had suffered badly after a contract dispute with a Manchester supplier. Aldrich responded to financial pressure by drinking heavily and disappearing for entire weekends to gambling establishments in York. Twice Sibella had discovered letters from creditors, addressed to their estate, demanding payment for debts she never knew existed. The diamond earring she once displayed so proudly had been quietly pawned 2 months earlier to cover household expenses Aldrich refused to acknowledge. Rosanna's elegant marriage had proven equally hollow. Lord Jasper Edworth maintained impeccable manners in public and devastating indifference in private. He spent most nights away from their estate, attending political dinners that Rosanna was never invited to accompany him to. Servants whispered about a widow in Bath whom Jasper visited with suspicious regularity. Rosanna's lonely evenings were spent writing letters that went unanswered and rearranging rooms nobody entered. Even Cressida's fresh engagement showed early fractures. Captain Everett Hale, whose military bearing had initially seemed romantic, revealed controlling tendencies within weeks of the announcement. He questioned Cressida's friendships, criticized her wardrobe choices, and interrupted her sentences during dinner, with the casual authority of a man who believed his wife's voice existed primarily to agree with his own. Yet none of the sisters examined their own situations honestly. Instead, their frustration converged entirely upon Isaline. "She has manipulated him somehow," Sibella insisted during a private afternoon in the drawing room, while Lord Harland and Lady Margot attended a neighboring estate. "No man of that status suddenly pursues a woman like Isaline without something calculated behind it." Rosanna nodded carefully. "She presents herself as helpless. Men with broken histories enjoy believing they are rescuing someone. It feeds their pride." Cressida, whose resentment had sharpened considerably since her engagement, added coldly, "She will humiliate this family when he inevitably loses interest." and we will be left explaining why the Marks briefly entertained our unmarried sister before discarding her like everyone else has. The conspiracy that followed was not spontaneous, it was architectural. Sibella, through social connections maintained from her London season, arranged for Lady Oriana Sable to receive an invitation to Lord Harland's spring dinner, an annual gathering of influential families hosted at Durnford Hall each April. Oriana, whose reputation had suffered considerably after the Blackfane scandal, accepted eagerly. The opportunity to reappear inside the same room as Theron, in a setting she could control socially, was precisely the kind of second chance she had been waiting for. Rosanna contributed a second weapon. Through Jasper's parliamentary contacts, she sent a carefully worded letter to Duke Corvin Ashgrove, suggesting that the spring dinner would provide an excellent opportunity for renewed business discussions with Lord Harland. The letter failed to mention that Eastline would be present, or that Theron had been visiting regularly, but Rosanna understood precisely what Corvin's presence would accomplish. It would remind Eastline of her place, of being rejected, of being insufficient. The spring dinner arrived on a warm April evening, scented with wisteria and cut grass. 30 guests gathered inside the Durnford dining room beneath candlelight, while servants carried platters of roasted lamb with mint jelly, poached pears and red wine, creamed leeks, saffron rice, and warm bread rolls brushed with rosemary butter. Theron arrived and took his seat beside Isaline, whose pale green gown chosen by Lady Margot suited her far better than anything she would have selected herself. Then, Lady Oriana Sable entered the dining room. The temperature of the evening shifted immediately. Oriana wore deep burgundy silk that moved like liquid around her figure, her auburn hair arranged with deliberate carelessness designed to appear effortless. She smiled warmly at Lord Harland, complimented Lady Margot's table arrangements with practiced grace, and took her seat directly across from Theron with the confidence of a woman who had rehearsed this entrance thoroughly. Throughout dinner, Oriana performed brilliantly. She referenced shared memories from London with subtle intimacy. She laughed at precisely calibrated moments. She touched her collarbone while speaking, drawing attention to the emerald pendant resting against her skin. Theron responded with the same immaculate, hollow courtesy he reserved for every social performance he had encountered in the past 4 years. He answered her directly. He never once leaned toward her. His attention returned consistently to Isaline beside him. Then Duke Corvin Ashgrove arrived late, apologizing charmingly for travel delays, and took his seat near the far end of the table. Isaline saw him before he saw her. The color drained from her face slowly, like warmth leaving a room after the fire dies. Her hand tightened around the stem of her wineglass until Theron noticed the trembling. He followed her gaze toward Corvin. Then he looked back at Isaline's expression, and his jaw set with quiet resolve. After dinner, while guests moved into the drawing room for port and conversation, Corvin approached Isaline near the mantelpiece with the relaxed confidence of a man who had already categorized her as someone he had outgrown. "Miss Durnford," he said pleasantly, "it has been quite some time. You look well." The word well carried the faint implication of surprise, as though wellness was an unexpected achievement for someone in her position. Before Isaline could respond, Corvin continued with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "I understand the Marquess has been visiting frequently. How wonderful for you. Fenella and I were just saying how delightful it is when unexpected attention arrives later in life." The sentence was crafted to wound without leaving visible marks. Later in life, unexpected attention. Every word placed to remind her that she was a charity case, not a choice. Isaline opened her mouth to respond, but Theron's voice came from directly behind Corvin. "Later in life," Theron repeated calmly, stepping into the conversation with the kind of controlled authority that made the surrounding air feel heavier. An interesting phrase from a man who chose a wife based entirely on her family's connections rather than her character. Corvin turned sharply. His smile faltered. Theron continued without raising his voice. I have spent the past several weeks in Miss Durnford's company. During that time, she has demonstrated more integrity, more intelligence, and more genuine decency than the combined total of every person I have encountered in London society across the past decade, including, I suspect, whatever qualities you found so urgently replaceable when you discarded her. The drawing room had gone completely silent. Lord Harland stood frozen near the fireplace. Lady Margot pressed her hand flat against the mantelpiece for balance. Sibella's face had turned the color of fresh plaster. Rosanna stared at the carpet. Oriana, still holding her wineglass near the doorway, looked as though she had been struck cleanly across the face. Corvin said nothing. For the first time in his adult life, the Duke had absolutely nothing prepared to say. Then Theron turned toward the three sisters still visible near the drawing-room entrance. He studied them for a moment with an expression that carried neither anger nor contempt, only the quiet devastation of clarity. I am also aware, he said evenly, who arranged this evening's guest list, and why. Nobody breathed. Theron looked at Iseline, whose eyes had filled with tears she was fighting desperately to contain. Then he offered her his arm. Shall we walk? They left the drawing room together while 30 guests stood in absolute silence behind them, and the sound of their footsteps echoed through the corridor, like the closing of a chapter that could never be reopened. They walked through the darkened garden without speaking until they reached the bench beneath the old willow near the lake, where Iseline had sobbed alone after Sibella's celebration. Nearly 2 years earlier, she sat down slowly. The tears she had been holding broke through, the moment the silence around them felt safe enough to collapse into. Theron stood beside the bench without sitting, giving her the space to fall apart without an audience beyond himself. For several minutes, the only sounds were her uneven breathing and the distant rustle of wind through branches above them. Then Iseline spoke through the tears, her voice stripped of every defense she had spent years perfecting. Nobody has ever said anything like that for me. Not once. Not ever. Theron looked down at her. His expression had changed again, deeper this time, past the crack that had opened the night he watched her catch a falling man without hesitation. Then he sat beside her on the bench and said something she was not expecting. I need to tell you something about Edwin Calder. Iseline's breathing stopped. Theron continued quietly. During the weeks he had been visiting Durnford Hall, his steward Callum had conducted discreet inquiries into Iseline's history, not from suspicion, but because Theron understood that a woman carrying the kind of sadness Iseline wore did not arrive at it without a story she was not telling. What Callum discovered through financial records and a conversation with a retired solicitor in Cheltenham was that Lord Harland had paid Edwin Calder's family debts in full on the condition that Edwin disappear without explanation. Edwin had written a letter to Iseline explaining everything. Lord Harland had intercepted and destroyed it. Edwin did not abandon you, Theron said carefully. He was given an impossible choice between you and his family's survival, and the man who forced that choice was your father. Iseline sat completely still on the bench while the words entered her body, like something sharp and clean, cutting through years of believing she had been discarded without cause. The tears that followed were different from any she had cried before, not the quiet, trained tears of a woman accustomed to private grief. These came from somewhere deeper, somewhere she had sealed shut the morning she decided Edwin simply had not loved her enough to stay. She cried for the years she spent believing she was not worth fighting for. She cried for the letter she never received. She cried for the young woman who stopped playing piano and stopped arguing at dinner and stopped believing that being herself was enough, all because a lie had been constructed so carefully around her that she mistook it for truth. Theron did not touch her. He did not offer hollow comfort or attempt to reduce the magnitude of what she was processing. He sat beside her on the cold bench and let her feel all of it because he understood from personal experience that some truths can only be absorbed through pain before they become liberation. When the worst of it had passed, Iseline wiped her face with trembling hands and looked at him with red, swollen eyes that held something new inside them. Not hope. Exactly. Something before hope. The first fragile recognition that the story she had been telling herself about her own life had been built on a foundation someone else had poisoned. "Why did you find this?" she whispered. "Why did you look?" "Because I needed to understand," Theron answered quietly, "whether the sadness I see inside you was placed there by the world or whether it grew on its own. It matters to me which one is true. Why? Because I intend to ask you to marry me. And I refuse to build anything on ground I do not understand completely." The words landed in the cold garden air between them with the weight of something irreversible. Iseline stared at him. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Theron reached into his coat and removed a small velvet box. Inside rested a ring, a single sapphire set in white gold, surrounded by a constellation of tiny diamonds that glittered beneath the faint lantern light reaching them from the garden path. "Not here," he said. "Not tonight." "You deserve time to feel everything you have just learned before answering anything. But I wanted you to know while you were sitting here believing you were never chosen, that you are wrong." He placed the box gently in her hands. "You were always worth choosing. The people around you were simply incapable of seeing it." Iseline pressed the velvet box against her chest and closed her eyes. And for the first time in years, the silence inside her did not feel like emptiness. It felt like the moment just before something enormous begins. The Grand Summer Ball at Harrington Palace was the single most prestigious social gathering of the London season. 400 guests filled the enormous ballroom beneath a ceiling painted with mythological scenes gilded in real gold leaf. Crystal chandeliers the size of carriages hung above polished marble floors that reflected candlelight like still water. Orchestras played from raised platforms at both ends of the hall, while footmen in powdered wigs carried silvered trays of champagne, sugared almonds, smoked salmon arranged on toast points, medallions of beef in red wine sauce, roasted quail with fig compote, and towers of profiteroles dripping with dark chocolate. Diamonds flashed from every direction. Titles announced at the entrance echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling like roll calls of English power. Duke Corvin Ashgrove arrived early with Lady Fenella on his arm, precisely as he had planned. Fenella wore white silk embroidered with gold thread, a tiara borrowed from the Ashgrove family vault, and an expression of polished satisfaction that she maintained with the discipline of a woman who understood her primary function was ornamental. Corvin moved through the crowd collecting congratulations and compliments, with practiced ease. His marriage remained new enough that he intended tonight to cement it publicly as the finest match of the year. Near the center of the ballroom, Lord Pemberton approached with a broad smile. "Ashgrove, you must be tremendously satisfied. A beautiful wife, a powerful name. What more could any man ask?" Corvin straightened his cuffs and smiled. "I have a wife now," he replied, projecting his voice clearly enough for a wide circle of guests to hear. "A wife worthy of the Ashgrove name." Applause and murmurs of approval rippled outward. Fenella pressed closer against his arm and tilted her chin upward. Then the footman at the entrance drew breath and announced the next arrival in a voice that carried across the entire hall. "The Most Honorable, the Marquis of Blackvane and Lady Iseline, Blackvane, Marchioness of Blackvane." The ballroom did not simply fall quiet. It ceased. Conversations stopped mid-syllable. Wine glasses paused between table and lip. 400 faces turned simultaneously toward the grand staircase. Iseline descended the marble steps wearing deep midnight blue velvet embroidered with tiny silver stars along the bodice and sleeves. The sapphire comb in her dark hair caught the chandelier light with each step, scattering fragments of blue across the white stone around her. She moved without hurry, without performance, without the desperate need for approval that characterized so many entrances in rooms like this. On her arm stood Theron Blackfane. His expression was calm, composed, and entirely focused on the woman beside him, as though 400 staring faces were simply furniture arranged around the only person in the room who mattered. They had married privately 3 weeks earlier in the chapel at Blackfane Manor, with only Winora, Callum, Bet, and a local clergyman present. No announcement had been sent. No newspapers had been informed. The marriage existed in quiet, deliberate opposition to every spectacle Isoline had ever been excluded from. Tonight was the first time society would learn. The silence inside Harrington Palace lasted exactly 7 seconds before it shattered into whispers, so intense they sounded like wind moving through dry leaves. That cannot be the Durnford daughter. The eldest? The one who never married? She married Blackfane. How is that possible? As anyone told Ashgrove, Corvin had already seen. He stood exactly where he had been standing moments earlier, his hand still resting on Fenella's arm, his champagne glass still raised at the precise angle of a man celebrating his own success, but his face had changed completely. The confident satisfaction had drained away, replaced by something raw and uncontrolled that he could not arrange quickly enough to hide. Because walking toward him across the polished marble floor of the most exclusive ballroom in England, on the arm of a man whose wealth, influence, and title eclipsed his own in every measurable dimension, was the woman he had discarded at his own birthday celebration years earlier. And she looked nothing like the quiet, gray-gowned figure he had dismissed, without a second glance. She looked like someone who had finally stopped apologizing for existing. Fenella noticed her husband's expression immediately. She followed his gaze toward Isoline and Theron, and for the first time that evening, her composure flickered. "Who is that?" she asked quietly. Corvin did not answer. Across the ballroom, Lord Harland and Lady Margot stood frozen near the refreshment table, their faces carrying the unmistakable weight of people watching consequences arrive for decisions they had hoped would never be examined publicly. Sabella gripped her borrowed necklace with white knuckles. Rosanna looked physically ill. Cressida stared at the floor. Theron guided Isoline through the crowd without stopping for introductions or small talk. Guests parted before them naturally, the way people step aside for something they recognize as significant, even before understanding why. Then, Theron stopped walking. He stopped in the exact center of the ballroom, beneath the largest chandelier, where the light was brightest and every face in every direction could see clearly. He turned toward Isoline and took both of her hands in his. The orchestra fell silent without being instructed. Theron spoke in a voice that carried across the hall with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 4 years in silence and had chosen this moment specifically to break it. "I have spent most of my life surrounded by people who valued appearance above substance, charm above honesty, and status above character. I believed that was simply how the world operated. I accepted it. I withdrew from it. And I fully intended to remain withdrawn permanently." He paused. The silence inside the ballroom was so complete that Isoline could hear her own heartbeat. Then I watched a woman catch a falling stranger in a ballroom where nobody else moved. I watched her comfort servants who were frightened. I watched her organize celebrations she was never thanked for and endure cruelty from her own family, with a dignity that would have destroyed most people standing in this room tonight, myself included. Tears burned behind Isoline's eyes. She held her breath until the wave steadied. Theron continued, his voice steady but carrying an emotion he was no longer interested in concealing. "She never mentioned my title. She never referenced my wealth. She never performed a single calculated gesture designed to capture my attention. And in doing all of that, she captured something far more difficult to reach. She earned my respect, which is something no amount of beauty, status, or ambition has ever accomplished before." He lifted her hand slightly, and the sapphire ring on her finger caught the chandelier light with such clarity that gasps moved through the crowd like a wave. "This woman is my wife, and she is the finest person I have ever known." The ballroom erupted. Applause crashed across the hall from every direction. Women dabbed their eyes openly. Men who had spent the evening discussing politics found themselves inexplicably moved. Servants standing along the walls smiled without attempting to hide it. Corvin stood motionless while the ovation continued around him. Fenella had released his arm at some point during the speech, though neither of them noticed when. Eastline looked up at Theron through tears. She had stopped trying to control. Her trembling hands tightened around his while years of humiliation, invisibility, and grief collided against the single unbearable reality that someone had finally, publicly, chosen her. Not despite who she was. Because of it. Across the ballroom, Lady Margot lowered her head. Not from shame performed for the benefit of observers. Real shame. The kind that arrives when you finally see the damage clearly enough to understand you cannot undo it. Lord Harlan said nothing. His silence, for once, was not strategic. It was the silence of a man standing inside the consequences of his own architecture, watching the daughter he dismissed become the most celebrated woman in the room. And standing near the far wall, partially hidden behind a marble pillar, Bet watched everything with tears streaming freely down her face and both hands pressed flat against her chest. Because the maid earning £12 a year had always known. She had simply been waiting for the rest of the world to see it. 5 years passed after that night at Harrington Palace. Atheline Blackfane became one of the most quietly beloved figures in English society, not because of her title, though it carried enormous weight, but because of what she did with it. She established a trust through the Blackfane estate that funded education for the daughters of domestic servants, girls who would otherwise have spent their lives polishing silver in houses where nobody learned their names. She visited tenant families personally during harsh winters, arriving with supplies rather than sending servants in her place. She remembered the names of groundskeepers' children, asked after ailing relatives of kitchen staff, and treated every person inside Blackfane Manor with the same unhurried attention that had once made her invisible inside Durnford Hall. Society noticed, not loudly, and not through newspapers, but through the steady accumulation of small recognitions that eventually become reputation. Women who met her at gatherings remarked afterward that she listened with unusual sincerity. Men who conducted business with Theron noted that his household operated with rare warmth. Theron himself had changed in ways that surprised even Wynora, who had spent decades worrying her grandson would die, emotionally sealed inside his own fortress. He smiled more frequently, though never extravagantly. He attended social events willingly rather than strategically. He spent evenings reading beside Isoline in the library while rain battered the eastern windows, their silence no longer the isolation of wounded people hiding from the world, but the comfortable quiet of two people who had stopped needing noise to feel accompanied. Wynora, now 84, watched them from her favorite chair beside the drawing room fire one December evening and said nothing, but she closed her eyes with the expression of someone who had been holding a long breath and had finally, gratefully released it. Meanwhile, the lives that had once overshadowed Isoline's existence collapsed with the slow inevitability of structures built on compromised foundations. Aldrich Fenn's textile empire crumbled after a catastrophic investment in a shipping venture that failed spectacularly during a winter storm season. Creditors seized the Fenn estate within 18 months. Sibella, who had once mocked Isoline for serving guests at her own engagement celebration, found herself selling jewelry and dismissing servants she could no longer afford. Aldrich disappeared to the continent, with debts and a woman half his age, leaving Sibella alone inside a rented house in a town where nobody recognized the Durnford name. Lord Jasper Edworth's infidelities eventually became too public to ignore. The widow in Bath sold letters to a London newspaper that printed enough detail to destroy Rosanna's remaining social standing within a single week. Jasper, protected by political connections, suffered minimal consequences. Rosanna, unprotected by anything except a name that no longer carried weight, retreated to a small cottage in Gloucestershire, where silence became her permanent companion. Captain Everett Hale's controlling nature deepened into something darker after the wedding. Cressida's bright laughter, the quality that had once made her the center of every room, disappeared entirely within a year. She wrote letters to Lady Margot describing loneliness so precisely that even her mother, who had spent decades prioritizing appearances over emotions, could not ignore the pain between the lines. Yet, Cressida refused to leave, trapped by the same obsession with propriety that the Durnford family had worshipped above everything else. Duke Corvin Ashgrove's marriage to Fenella survived in the technical sense, but warmth had never been part of its construction. They attended events together with impeccable coordination and returned home to separate wings of the Ashgrove estate. Fenella, who had married a title rather than a person, eventually stopped pretending disappointment and settled into the comfortable numbness of a woman who had received exactly what she negotiated for, and discovered it was not enough. Corvin thought about Isoline more often than he would ever admit, not with love, because what he had offered her had never been love. With the particular regret of a man who chose the obvious option and spent the rest of his life watching someone else discover the extraordinary one he discarded. One gray February afternoon, 3 carriages arrived at Blackvane Manor within hours of each other, carrying women who had not spoken to Isoline in years. Sabella arrived first, thinner than Isoline remembered, wearing a coat that had been mended twice at the elbows. Rosanna followed, her face carrying an exhaustion that no amount of sleep could address. Cressida came last, quieter than she had ever been, her eyes holding something fragile that Isoline recognized immediately, because she had carried it herself for years. They gathered in the drawing room beside the fire, while snow fell steadily beyond the tall windows overlooking the sea. None of them could meet Isoline's eyes easily. Sabella spoke first, her voice stripped of every trace of the confidence that had once allowed her to humiliate her eldest sister in front of 200 guests. "We did not come to ask forgiveness. We know we do not deserve it." Rosanna pressed her hands together tightly in her lap. "We came because we had nowhere else to go, and because you are the only person in our family who ever treated anyone with genuine kindness, including people who never returned it." Cressida said nothing. She simply looked at Isoline with an expression that communicated more than any words she could have arranged. Isoline studied her 3 sisters for a long moment. She saw Sabella's mended coat. She saw Rosanna's hollow exhaustion. She saw Cressida's silence and understood everything it contained. Then she called for tea, asked Betta to prepare 3 guest rooms in the East Wing, and sat beside her sisters while the fire crackled softly and the snow continued falling outside. She did not deliver speeches about forgiveness. She did not remind them of what they had done. She did not perform generosity for the satisfaction of proving she had risen above their cruelty. She simply made room for them inside her home the same way she had always made room for anyone who needed it, quietly, without conditions, and without expecting anything in return. Because Isoline Blackvane had never needed revenge to prove her worth, she had only ever needed someone to finally see it. And in the end, England learned what the Durnford family discovered too late: that real love and true worth were never carried inside diamond rings, family names, or ballroom announcements. They lived inside the ordinary moments nobody applauded, inside the hands that caught a falling stranger, inside the silence of a woman who chose kindness long after the world gave her every reason to choose bitterness instead. And those things, the quiet things, outlasted everything else.